Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Julia McPherson. I'm the Director of Advocacy and Operations at Jesuit Refugee Service USA. In recognition of World Refugee Day, taking place this Saturday, June 20th, we're happy to have you with us for Welcome and Protect, a conversation on the impact of U.S. policies on asylum seekers. Earlier today, UNHCR, the UN Refugee Agency, announced record high global displacement figures with almost 80 million people forcibly displaced around the world. We also recognize that today is an important day for the US immigrant community, as the Supreme Court voted to block the administration's efforts to end DACA. We join our partners in celebrating this victory and stand with them as they work towards a more permanent solution for dreamers. The reality is that the US remains the largest recipient of new individual applications for asylum, while the US government continues to implement policies that are chipping away at our current asylum system. Just this week, a new proposed regulation was published, which would put in place several new barriers to asylum. This past March, access to asylum was halted as the US closed its borders in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. To date, more than 20,000 people have been expelled without the opportunity to file for asylum or other protections. And last year, the US announced a new policy called the Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico, which forces asylum seekers to return to Mexico as they wait for their claim to be processed. Since it was launched, more than 64,000 people have been returned to Mexico as they petition for safety in the US. These issues are important to Jesuit Refugee Service as we work to accompany, serve, and advocate on behalf of forcibly displaced persons worldwide. Our newest policy brief, Stranded, provides an overview of US asylum policy and also captures stories of those impacted through the eyes of our colleagues at JRS Mexico and also our friends at the Kino Border Initiative. We're happy to have both voices represented on our panel today, as well as the expertise of our partners at Refugees International. Now, before we get started, we just have a few housekeeping items. The conversation today is being streamed on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. It will also be recorded for future viewing and sharing. We'll have time at the end for Q&A, so feel free to send any questions you have on whichever platform you're tuned into. Or you can send an email to communications@jrsusa.org. And let us know that you're tuned in by using hashtag welcome and protect, one word. Again, it's hashtag welcome and protect, one word. Now, to get us started, our first speaker is YAEL SCHACHER, Senior U.S. Advocate at Refugees International. YAEL will present a brief overview of U.S. asylum policy, including more details on some of the policy developments I mentioned earlier. At Refugees International, YAEL focuses on U.S. asylum, U.S. refugee admissions, temporary protected status, and humanitarian visas. Prior to joining Refugees International, YAEL worked on her forthcoming book about the history of asylum in the United States as a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Texas at Austin. She spent several years teaching about immigration at the University of Connecticut and volunteering at the Legal Services Office of the Connecticut Institute for Refugees and Immigrants. She has an MA in History and a PhD in American Studies from Harvard University. Thank you so much, YAEL, for joining us today. I'll give you the floor.
Thanks so much for having me. What a wonderful event this is. And today I just wanted to say that the UN also announced that it would be restarting resettlement in the United States that had been paused because of the COVID crisis, which is a wonderful thing because people who are resettled make up a small number of the people who need refuge in the world, but are some of the most vulnerable. So that's good news. What's not great news is what's going on with our asylum system. Just before I started at RI, as Julia mentioned, I was a historian, basically studying how the US has dealt with refugees and asylum seekers. Many say that asylum was born after World War II, and in the US context, this is partly true. Soon after the war, the United Nations Convention relating to the status of refugees was codified and signed, but not by the United States at that time. According to the UN Convention, a refugee is a person who has a, quote, well-founded fear of persecution based upon their race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or membership in a particular social group. The convention also has an article on the obligation of non-refoulement, or the non-return of an asylum seeker to a country where their life or freedom would be threatened on any of those grounds. The U.S. didn't sign the convention at the time in the 1950s. It had a refugee resettlement program of people from Europe who had been victims during World War II, of Hungarians in the 1950s, but it didn't have a border asylum policy. Indeed, at the time that the convention was written, the State Department official, the United States State Department official, basically argued that the U.S. didn't need to sign the convention because it gave refugees all the rights that they needed in the United States, and that, quote, refoulement was not something that the United States had to deal with because, quote, it was not so geographically situated as to receive many illegal entrants. That was in August of 1950, and then it wasn't true. It's certainly not true now. So what I mean to say is that it sort of ignored the border at the time. And even in the 1950s, when the first World Refugee year happened, it was mostly focused on a relatively narrow group of refugees. It wasn't quite the whole world. It was mostly focused on refugees in Europe and the Middle East. There were, the people who still were sort of left in camps in Europe from World War II. And it was very successful, that World Refugee year in 1960, to sort of empty those camps and solve the problem and put the refugee problem on the map. But it wasn't until the 1960s that the world began to incorporate more of the world, Africa and Asia and elsewhere. And in 1968, the U.S. finally signed the Refugee Convention. And Lyndon Johnson, when he sent it to the Senate, basically said this, that foremost among the humanitarian rights which the protocol provides, the protocol to convention, is the prohibition against expulsion or return of refugees to any country in which they would face persecution. Through a number of other specific guarantees, refugees are to be accorded rights which, taken together, would enable them to cease being refugees and instead become self-supporting members of free societies living under conditions of dignity and self-respect. And this is important because some of the other rights that we accord asylum seekers in the United States and refugees are sort of the right to work, other things that we associated with that dignity that was that dignity that was mentioned there. And the reason I mention this is because not only has the Trump administration sort of limited eligibility for asylum and limited access to the border to even ask for asylum, and it has also stripped away some of those rights that asylum seekers have even once they're in the process of seeking asylum in the United States. In 1980, the United States actually incorporated that UN convention into our law, into the United States law in the Refugee Act. That incorporated the UN Convention definition of a refugee, and also the non-refoulement obligation that I mentioned. It also asked the Attorney General to set up a procedure for how to apply for asylum. And it was supposed to be uniform. It wasn't supposed to have any ideological or geographical biases. Unfortunately, in the 1980s, at the end of the Cold War, there were still a lot of biases. So Iranians or Polish people who asked for asylum in the United States had a much higher likelihood of getting asylum than did Guatemalans or Salvadorans. And in fact, litigation in the courts about that disparity led to the idea that the United States needed to really create a uniform system where refugee applications would not take into account border enforcement concerns or which country a person came from. Each individual application and each claim for persecution would have to be decided on its own merits. In the 1990s, strides were made. The United States set up an asylum officers corps. There were new ideas about how people fleeing gender violence could be considered refugees. There were also some things that happened in the 1990s and the early 2000s that actually made it harder to apply for refugee status or gain refugee status as an asylum seeker. There was this expedited removal process that made the process at the border of applying for asylum much quicker. There are new bars put up against people who would be not be eligible for asylum, especially in some people who are really fleeing harm. The Obama administration faced a crisis, as many of you may know, in beginning around 2012 and really in 2014, 2015, with a lot of people, Central American women and children especially, seeking protection from the United States, fleeing basically gangs, gender-based violence, coercion, extortion, corruption, and ineffectual governments. And the UNHCR at that time recognized that they were refugees. The United States, in the initial response of the Obama administration, was to detain asylum seekers. I forgot to mention, in the 1990s, one of the other major important things that happened was that a new law was put in place that basically said if you were seeking asylum at the border, you were going to be detained throughout the process. And the Obama administration initially detained families seeking asylum from Central America together, and the courts basically said they had, you had to let them out relatively quickly. You couldn't just detain them like that. But that was a big problem, sort of how to manage this in a humane way. And a lot of them were unaccompanied minors, which special protections exist for under U.S. law. The Obama administration came up with some good ideas. There was a family case management program which allowed asylum seekers to pursue asylum outside of detention. In other words, with caseworkers, and go to immigration court. And have caseworkers help them through the process without needing to be detained. And it was very successful in terms of cost and also in terms of people following through with their court hearings. There was a Central American minors program that was set up that allowed parents who are legally in the United States to actually apply for their children to come to the United States as refugees. There was a memo that said, by the administration, that said if you were seeking asylum and you pass an initial credible fear screening, that you would not necessarily, you were eligible for parole and you did not need to be detained. And then, of course, there was DACA, which didn't really affect the new people coming in because you had to have come to the United States before 2007 to really qualify, but still. And also, finally, there was a very important decision from the immigration courts that said that if somebody fleeing domestic violence could qualify for asylum. So these were a lot of important things were made, some new ways of dealing with things. There's a lot of problems and struggles, but there are also some good ideas on the table that broaden protections, and a lot of these have been pushed back by the Trump administration. The most important ones Julia mentioned at the top, and I should say, I visited the detention centers, the family detention centers, when I was a postdoctoral fellow at UT in Carnes, and I saw how the credible fear screenings worked under the Obama administration. And what has happened now at the border is that, despite those problems, now, rather than have trained asylum officers doing credible fear screenings and giving people enough time to actually prepare for them, now sometimes Border Patrol agents do credible fear screenings, or the process is extremely rushed. In the Remain in Mexico program, there's really no chance for asylum seekers to explain why they fled their home country. They're sort of sent back to Mexico. And while I've been at RI, I visited the border many, many times to see, what was happening to the people who were sent back to Mexico to sort of wait for their asylum hearings in U.S. immigration court. The immigration courts, which have a long time been arbitrary, and there are certain parts of the country where you can kind of never win asylum, have gotten, the due process and the ability to gain asylum in the immigration courts under the Remain in Mexico program are practically nil. I mean, it's very, very difficult, and there's very, very little way for people to find attorneys. Other policies that have been put in place, limited eligibility for asylum. In other words, that decision about women fleeing gender violence being eligible for asylum has been reversed by the Attorney General. And in the new rule that Julia mentioned, that's going to be codified into law, so that eligibility is going to be shrunk. And then there are other bars to asylum. There's a bar that says that if you transited a third country on your way to the United States, you can't ask for asylum in the United States. There are so many bars being put up, and a lot of them are working together. I went to Guatemala to sort of interview some folks in February who had been sent to Guatemala from the US border. And the idea was that they were supposed to ask for asylum in Guatemala rather than the United States under an agreement that the US has with the Guatemalan government. And to give you a sense of just how badly all these policies are working together, while I was in Guatemala, I actually interviewed somebody who was in the Remain in Mexico program who decided to go back to Guatemala, not to where he originally fled from, but to actually wait there because it was going to take so long for him to have his court hearing in the United States. And he didn't feel safe in northern Mexico, where Human Rights First has documented hundreds and hundreds of murders and rapes. It's very, very dangerous. So he went to Guatemala to wait, and then went back to the border in March for his asylum hearing, to go have his asylum hearing in the United States Immigration Court. Got turned away because all those hearings had been put on hold because of the COVID crisis. And recently he disappeared. We don't know where he is. And it's possible he tried to re-enter the United States during this expulsion policy that has been put in place. We're not sure. I'm very worried he sort of has died in the desert. But all of these policies are sort of working in tandem in a horrible way. And the last thing I'll say is about the CDC rule that basically allows for these expulsions at the border. It's justified in the name of public health, but actually, if you read through the order and the way it's been put in place, it really only targets asylum seekers for expulsion. And it's justified because they say that if we try to actually screen asylum seekers at the border, we'd have to detain them and COVID would spread. But we don't have to detain asylum seekers. We can allow asylum seekers into the United States with case management, as I mentioned before. And what it's actually done is what I mentioned before. It's put people back into Mexico where it's unhealthy to stay. They have no place to stay, no money, no food. And sometimes they end up going back to their home countries or trying to re-enter in the United States in precarious places and disappear. I mean, there's no monitoring going on. And I think about 40,000 people have been expelled at this time. Over 1,000 children have been expelled. And I think the United States has let maybe 4 people actually ask for asylum. So this is basically this border policy, which has been extended indefinitely, the COVID border policy, plus the new rule that limits asylum eligibility in so many ways and codifies some of the other practices that I've talked about relating to eligibility, but also the transit rule ban, and it makes the credible fear process and the screening process even more cursory and gives asylum seekers even less of a chance to present their case in court, in immigration court, is really, I fear, an end to asylum. And the 1980 Refugee Act created 2 systems, the resettlement system that we resettle people with, but also the asylum system. And both are under threat. The resettlement system has been shrunken dramatically. We only resettle last year, I think. Last year was about 27,000. This year, maybe it will be, it's supposed to be 18,000. I don't think we'll get there. But the asylum system, the dramatic curtailments of rights under the asylum system really mean that this could possibly be the end of asylum. And as I said, we made a lot of progress, in the 1990s and 2000s. And I think what we need to do is really push back against so many of these restrictions. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks so much. Yeah, I really appreciate it. We know that it's a complicated system. I think it was helpful to hear a little bit of the context and the history in terms of how we got to where we are today. So you have a lot of knowledge, and I'm sure that in the Q&A section, folks might have some follow-up questions as well. So if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to start chatting, putting those in the chat or in the comment section. I'm sure Yael will be happy to answer them later on. But for now, we will move on to our next speaker, Patricia Hernandez Lopez. She's a colleague of ours, the country director for JRS in Mexico. And I had the pleasure of visiting our programs in Mexico earlier this year. And I'm really thrilled that Patricia could join us today. She'll give us an insider's view on the impact of US policies on asylum seekers in Mexico, including the Mexican government's response. So how are some of the policies that Yael shared with us really impacting asylum seekers on the ground, and how are organizations like JRS working with them? To give you a bit of Patricia's background information, she received her PhD in migration studies from El Colegio de la Frontera Norte in Tijuana, Mexico, and has master's degrees in social science and local development. She graduated with a bachelor's in international affairs from the University of El Salvador. Patricia has 7 years of experience in migration-related research, most recently focused on the reintegration of Salvadoran deportees. And previously, she worked on projects related to the prevention of youth violence and sustainable economics. So thank you, Patricia, for joining us today. We look forward to hearing your remarks.
Hi, Julia. Thank you for having me here. I'm very glad to share this space with you. Well, first time I'm going to talk a little bit about the work of JRS in Mexico. We came to Mexico in 2007, 2 years after the unaccompanied minor crisis. Since all these years, JRS Mexico has been accompanying migrants seeking refuge in Mexico, not only by working with the people with legal and psychological counseling, but accompanying the caravans that have been entering Mexico territory from 2017 to early 2020. JRS have been providing information to migrant population in Tapachula so that people can take informed decisions, because that is what we think that is important, to inform people so they can take good decisions about their lives. Currently, from Mexico City, we have the office in here, and we try to protect and defend our companions from advocacy work, as well as make our work visible and raise awareness to Mexican society through campaigns that are launched from communications. And in the other hand, we have like a very big work in the field office in Tapachula. Our staff formed by a team of 6 psychologists and 6 lawyers accompany people from a model of psychological care. The support that is sought to generate with these refugees are from legal to psychological and social and labor integration, because we believe that these people need like this accompany from us so that we can facilitate this integration in the local society. From social and legal integration, for social and legal integration, there are different programs. One of them are the trust groups of men, women, and young people, where in addition to continuing these psychological accompaniments, they aim to be the spaces for people to web their networks and facilitate the process of social integration. In addition, from the integration program, I look forward to make links with the host society activities that bring the refugee population closer to the local ones. Also, from the integration program, it searched for opening spaces with the business sector of Tapachula for the labor integration of this population. Along with this accompaniment, we also support migrants seeking refuge in Mexico with humanitarian aid, which consists in 3-month support fund for renting a space to live, and food provisions and medications in cases that people require it. And these humanitarian aids are granted through a selection process under the vulnerability criteria that we already have defined in our accompaniment manual. JRS Mexico works in network with different groups of organizations to achieve greater scope. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about which impacts we have from U.S. asylum policies modifications, and how these modifications have impact to Mexican government responses. And I can tell you a list of some of these impacts that we have observed from these modifications of asylum policies
in the United States. First of all, we have seen the detention increase with people. The detention of people increased in immigration stations in Mexico. Besides the reinforcement of militarization in Mexican territory, focus on fighting or stopping migration mainly to the northern border to Mexico. Automatic deportations from Mexico without access to regular process or without protections and alternatives has increased. The extensions of terms that could take up to 6 months before the pandemic, which can be interpreted as a practice for people to desist from seeking refuge in Mexico. More now, with the indefinite work stoppage of Comar due to the context of the pandemic. Many of these practices were already done to a lesser extent, but as locks on U.S. asylum policies have tightened, Mexico has also reinforced practices that violate human rights to migrants. Immigration regularization due to family ties in Mexico is around $2,000 for each regularization, which hinders the possibility of regularization of people who going on to Mexico without economic resources to carry out these processes. And these represent an action by the state contrary to their human rights. So we think that we have like to think about these measures that that put more difficult to migrant people in Mexico. Now with the pandemic in Mexico, since the quarantine began in Mexico, at the end of March, the method of working in the field office have changed. The staff is doing home office from then, which has involved to JRS providing telephones to the staff of psychologists and lawyers, enabling specific lines for attention. And these numbers were distributed on social networks and on signs in front of our office so that people could have access to these numbers. But we think that these limit our work very much because not all people have the capacity to make a phone call. Either they don't have a cell phone, or they can pay for a phone service. Although adaptation to this new reality has been very difficult for the staff of JRS Mexico, we had to develop strategies with the team to continue the accompaniment with the necessary prevention measures. But in all these months, the fieldwork has remained continuous. Likewise, the deliverers of humanitarian aid have had to carry it out by others alternatives in order to maintain the necessary precautions. So we can tell you that COVID disease has generated serious consequences for migrants request refugee in Mexico. Since with the closure of attention from public institutions, the processes, the process of refugee recognition has lenses, and people are practically around in Tapachula without answers, without work, and without needs in this city are increases more and more. That's what I can tell you about the situation that we are facing in Tapachula, Julia.
Thank you so much, Patricia. I think what your last sentence there, that they're waiting, without answers, without work, really speaks to this limbo that asylum seekers are finding themselves in, not only prior to the pandemic, but now as a result of the additional restrictions that have been placed on their mobility and on their access to the asylum process in Mexico because of the pandemic. So thank you so much for being with us and for sharing information about Jairus's work. Again, hopefully you can share a bit more once we get to the Q&A. But for now, we are going to move on to our last speaker, Joanna Williams, who is the Director of Education and Advocacy at the Kino Border Initiative, a fellow Jesuit ministry operating in Nogales, Arizona, and Sonora. Joanna graduated with a bachelor's in science from the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University and received a master's in public policy from Arizona State University. Prior to her current position, she journeyed with immigrants in a variety of contexts. She volunteered at a shelter in Tierra Blanca, Veracruz, conducted Fulbright research on the reintegration of deported and returned migrants, and worked as a coordinator for the American Civil Liberties Union's Border Litigation Project. Thanks so much, Joanna, for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks so much for welcoming me here. It's a joy to be able to share with you and really to see just by your participation in this webcast how interested you are in the realities of folks who might feel far away, but really who are close to our communities in the United States. So here at the Kino Border Initiative, we're located just on the US-Mexico border. We are a binational organization, so we legally exist on both sides of the border. And we work in 3 different dimensions. So we work on humanitarian aid, which means that this morning we served about 150 breakfasts and gave out clothes to recently deported individuals, as well as providing first aid medical services. But then the other 2 dimensions of work that we do are education and advocacy. So we try to listen very carefully to the individuals that we welcome in our aid center or serve outside of our aid center in these times of COVID where we're taking more precautions and social distancing. But we try to still listen carefully to individuals and think, how can we make sure that their voices are heard by communities on both sides of the border and by policy makers in the US and Mexico? Because really being in Nogales, Mexico, locating our humanitarian aid there means that we're seeing the impacts of this slew of policies that YAEL ran through very quickly but thoroughly, that the decisions that are made in Washington, the decisions that are made in Mexico City have implications for the individuals that we serve here in Nogales, Mexico. So I'm not going to recap all of what YAEL mentioned in terms of policies, but I think I want to draw out some themes of what she was talking about. So she was talking about the sweep of history of the U.S. asylum process. And honestly, we at the Kino Border Initiative haven't historically worked with asylum seekers that frequently. So we were founded in 2009 originally to serve people who were deported here to Nogales, Mexico. And it wasn't until 2014 and then 2016 and especially 2018 because that we started to see more and more asylum seekers arriving here in Nogales, Mexico, and started to listen more carefully to their stories of leaving their homes and thinking about the obstacles that they would face once they made it to the United States. The big picture of what YAEL was sharing about is that the asylum process in the US used to happen within the United States. So whether it was in detention or whether people were released to their families, they were going through a whole process to seek asylum within the US borders. And the strategy of the administration for the last 2 years has been to push people back into Mexico, or in some ways all the way down to Central America, in order to stop them from accessing that process in the US. So it's a policy that uses the word deterrent frequently, or deterrence, which I would say a synonym for deterrence is despair. These are asylum policies that are built to generate despair, to try to make people give up, with the thought that then they would stop seeking asylum. And that's part of the tradition, unfortunately, of our immigration policy, not just related to asylum, but also related to the border and militarization of the border, where pushing people out into the rural desert to cross has been a policy of despair. But that's what we have to grapple with the individuals that we serve here in Nogales, Sonora. So as I said, since about 2014, 2016, we started to see more asylum seekers. We primarily see individuals from Mexico and from Central America. In the recent year, we've seen also individuals from Cuba and from Venezuela who have arrived. It used to be that when people arrived to Nogales, Mexico, who were seeking asylum, they might receive our services for a few days, and then they would turn themselves into US authorities and then go through the asylum process in the United States. For us, one of the most dramatic changes was in 2018, with the implementation of the metering policy, or what's also known as turnbacks, where now when individuals walk up to the port of entry and say, I want to seek asylum, starting in May of 2018, just over 2 years ago, Customs and Border Protection officers started to say, you know, we just don't have space for you. There's no room. We can't process you at this moment. And what we've learned over the course of this time is that there wasn't necessarily room, but this was another policy related to despair and related to deterrence. So we started to see individuals who had to wait for longer and longer periods in Nogales, Mexico, before they could even start the process in the United States. And that's culminated with, both Julia and YAEL have mentioned the border closure, but right before the border closure, individuals were already in limbo for about 3 or 4 months here in Nogales, Mexico, just waiting to start their asylum process in the United States. And then here in Nogales, it was in January of 2020 that the US government implemented the migration, what's known as the Migration Protection Protocols. We sometimes call it migrant persecution protocols. It's also known as Remain in Mexico. But this policy under which people are returned to wait for their court dates in the United States. People who are returned to Nogales, Mexico, their court dates are in El Paso, Texas, which for those of you who aren't familiar with the geography of the border, at the very least, you know those are not the same city. El Paso, Texas is north of Juarez, of Ciudad Juarez. It's about a 10-hour bus ride on this side of the border for individuals to travel from Nogales, Mexico to their courts in El Paso. But most of the people who have been returned to Nogales under the MPP or Remain in Mexico program haven't had a single court date yet, because their first court dates were coming up in March, when all of a sudden the courts were suspended. And then they were suspended again for another month. And just yesterday we learned that they'll be suspended through most of July. So now individuals who returned here in January don't have court dates until October in some cases, the very first court date of the many court dates that they're going to have to go to seek asylum. So I know both Patricia and myself have used this word limbo several times, but I think that really is a word that captures the place that people are in and the effect that US policy has on people, whether that's denying them access to starting the asylum process or forcing them to be in Mexico while they undergo the asylum process. And part of the idea of this limbo, the strategy from the US perspective, is that US communities were outraged with the family separation policy. When we saw what was happening within our borders, ripping apart parents from kids, there was a lot of backlash from the community. But the administration, by pushing people into Nogales, Mexico and into other border cities, is removing people from our public consciousness. So it's invisibilizing those people here in Nogales, Mexico. And I think that's become particularly profound in the last 3 months during the pandemic, because the border closure that YAEL and Julia have made reference to is in many ways the extension of these anti-asylum policies, where the border's closed to quote unquote non-essential travel, which means that the border's actually not closed at all for most people with privilege. So I cross the border most days. There's oftentimes long lines of people waiting to cross the border. US citizens and legal permanent residents can still cross the border with no problem. As YAEL said, this is really a policy that's targeted at asylum seekers, that their travel, their fleeing for their lives is considered non-essential, when my travel to go back home is considered essential. And I would in a heartbeat switch out to say that the people that we're serving in Nogales, Mexico have a much more essential reason to be in the US than I do. And I could tell many stories of the many individuals that we welcome here that are in this limbo because of the history of the policy, but also the recent developments with the border closure. But I think one person that came to mind as I was preparing for this conversation is a family from Nicaragua that fled political persecution. Really touches on some of what Patricia mentioned, as well as the realities here in the northern border, because the journey is connected. So she's a mom. She came with her 4-year-old son and her husband, and they were fleeing political persecution in Nicaragua because they were opponents to the government. They came to Mexico trying to seek safety in Mexico. And along the way, they were extorted multiple times at these checkpoints. So Patricia spoke about the increase in militarization in southern Mexico. There's checkpoints throughout southern Mexico, and every time they went through a checkpoint, they would have to pay off Mexican officials for them to be able to go through. And then in one of the checkpoints, they were detained, or it was a little bit beyond one of those checkpoints, that they were stopped by the federal police actually, and then brought to an immigration detention center within Veracruz. The mom, being the advocate that she is, was very upset about the conditions and mistreatment in that detention center. And she started to speak out, and she filed a complaint with the Human Rights Agency. And one of the human rights officials told her, quite frankly, you know, the fact that you filed a complaint means you're going to be in here for even longer. And sure enough, she and her 4-year-old son spent many more days than the other people in that detention center. And we think in many ways because of the complaint that she filed, and in an effort to silence her voice. She and her boy and her husband ended up trying to seek asylum in Mexico. So they sought refugee status in Mexico. They weren't located where the JRS project is, but it's much like the individuals in Tapachula who are seeking refugee status or protection there. And they were starting to settle in southern Mexico when, unfortunately, because of the violence that they faced in the town that they were living, the discrimination, and also the challenges in seeking refugee status in Mexico, they weren't able to stay in that place. And they came up to the US-Mexico border very early this year, which meant that on March 20th, when the border officially closed, they'd been already waiting in Nogales, Mexico for 3 months to try to turn themselves into US officials and rejoin their family in the United States. They have family in the US that's really willing and ready to receive them, to help them go through the asylum process. But instead, here they are in Mexico, now having lived in Nogales, Mexico for 6 months. The mom is deeply concerned about the well-being of her 4-year-old and how this uncertainty in the voyage and the fact that he's not in a school setting or in a really structured setting for his development, how is that going to affect him in the long term? So she has so many anxieties related to his well-being, in addition to their economic well-being. What we've seen within the United States, we know that the coronavirus has had an impact on many different communities economically, and that has ripple effects here in Nogales, Mexico, because many families depended on the remittances from their families in the US in order to survive, in order to pay rent here in Nogales, Mexico. So that although they can receive food and other services from us, there's not sufficient shelter space within Nogales, Mexico, in order for everybody to stay in the shelters. So what's extraordinary to me is that despite these policies of despair, which have been really well designed by the Trump administration, the fierceness of the hope of the individuals that are still here in Nogales, Mexico, whether they're waiting to present for the first time, many of those who are waiting, who haven't started the asylum process, are Mexican, and they're fleeing violence in Mexico and are afraid that their persecutors might find them here. Others, again, from other countries. But they're fiercely hopeful, and they believe that our country can do better. They believe that there could be transformation in the US and that we might actually respect their right to protection. And I think that our invitation as a community is to live up to that hope, to be a part of that hope, to combat these policies of despair and not allow this continued ebbing away of access to protection, but instead make a moral call and act morally to remind our government and remind our community that we do have the capacity to welcome and we do have the capacity to protect.
Thanks so much, Joanna. That was fantastic. I think that fierceness of hope is really something that some of us have seen firsthand. And by telling stories like the one you shared, and we're able to really put a face to some of the policies and the impact that these policies are having on individuals and families. So thank you for that. I really appreciate it. And actually, now that we're ready for Q&A, again, just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, please use whichever platform you're tuned into to ask your question, or you can send an email to communications@jrsusa.org. We have about 15 minutes or so left, so we would be happy to, and I know the speakers will be happy to answer any questions that you might have. To get us started, and it's a nice pivot to Joanna from where you left off, we have a question from Kathleen on Facebook. So she asked, how do we tell the stories of asylum seekers to show that this is both a local and a global issue that deserves our attention? And I might just start first with Patricia. I think we've talked about, and we actually, when I was in Mexico, talked about a particular story of a woman who arrived at JRS's offices in Tapachula. And I wonder if you can maybe start, Patricia, by sharing a bit about her story, and then if others want to join in as well.
Yes, Julia, of course. We had this case last year in Tapachula that was from a woman who were from Honduras. She was 30 years old, and she was mother of 2 children. So back in Honduras, Maria had experienced like a lot of violence situations from the gangs that control like her community back in Honduras. So she decided, after talking with the father of the 2 children, who was in United States already, so they decided that Maria and the 2 children were going to go to United States for being free of this violence. So they started their journey to United States, but when they were almost getting into the north border of Mexico, they were kidnapped by a minibus that took them and take them to some place where people used to be beaten, tortured, and electrocuted. And for being released, the men asked them 5,000 people for $5,000 for each of the persons. I mean, 5,000 for Maria and like $15. So Maria contacted her children's father. So he was allowed to send them money, and that way they were released. But they were released in Rio Grande. So when they crossed that river, they were arrested by a U.S. border patrol, and they were in a detention center. And then after that, they offered to send them back to that city where they were kidnapped, or sending back to Tapachula, that is in the south border of Mexico. And then, like, as they were afraid, they preferred to come back again to the south border of Mexico, to Tapachula. And then we received them in our field office, and then we offered them to travel back for her asylum hearing. But then they decided not to come back to the interview, and because they were afraid to go back again to that city where they were kidnapped. So she decided that, well, as she couldn't go back to Honduras because of the situation, and then she didn't want to risk her children's life. They preferred to stay in Tapachula, but they are like facing times of uncertainty, and because it's a very difficult city too. So Maria now is stuck with their children in Tapachula, unable to return to neither to Honduras, neither to United States. Or so I think these like cases like this, like it's very difficult for us to see in our field, in our field office, because sometimes we want to help people. About that. Because we want to help people, but we are not allowed to do it because of all of these policies. So that's what I can share with you.
Thank you, Patricia. Thank you for sharing Maria's story. I don't know if Joanna or Yael, either of you would want to address this question as well.
Yeah, I think just to add a couple of pieces of advice maybe on how we can, I think it's an excellent question to ask, because it's not just about what are the stories, but how can we tell them in a way that deserves their attention, and because these are folks who deserve to have their voices heard. So how can we transmit that to people in the community? I think sometimes we, and I include myself in this large group of people who accompany migrants, we do ourselves a disservice when we're telling stories that might feel so distant or so unimaginable to the folks that are in neighborhoods in the US. What I would say is when you're telling the stories, whether that's the stories you're hearing here or others on the JRS or KBI websites, try to think about how can I tell this story in a way that we identify what I have in common with someone. When I'm a mom, I want to be a mom like this Nicaraguan mom that I talked about. And that's something that we really have in common and a bond. So there's more that makes us similar than what separates us. And I think in the way that we tell our stories, it's really important that we emphasize that point. And the second, both piece of advice, but also reality that I would add, is that the people who are stranded in Mexico, who are in Central America, have deep ties in US communities. The vast majority of the folks arriving to Nogales, Mexico, have, just for the example that Patricia gave, they have a family member in the US that's waiting to receive them. So this isn't an issue of people at the border, it's the issue of people in our neighborhoods whose families are divided by the border and who are eager to reunite. So to the extent that we can see it from that lens and see that this is the people within the US who are impacted by the separation and by the pushing back of asylum seekers, I think that can increase or make us at least recognize the US's stake in individuals' well-being here in Mexico.
Thanks, Joanna. We have actually another question. So this is from Kevin on Facebook, and he asks, it appears that we cannot impact policy or decisions made by officials. That can be quite challenging, to say the least. How do you all keep positive, and what keeps you going in doing what you are doing? I wonder, Yael, if you would want to start with that question.
Sure. I mean, part of it has to do with what we were just talking about, which is the sort of stories of the people and the kind of hope that people have to really gain asylum in the United States. And I just wanted to say that despite efforts at externalization that Joanna talked about, pushing people out of sight, making them invisible, what I found in interviewing people in Guatemala and in the border of the United States and Mexico was that many of them have family members in the United States. I think that's come out already, but several people who I know who could have gave up their asylum, went back to Guatemala, but their older daughter is in the United States in detention. They were separated at the border, but and people who came to seek asylum whose parents are still here, like in Joanna, or who have family members here, like Patricia talked about. Some people, in other words, these are family separation policies. And I think to get to the next point I raise that with members of Congress all the time. And there are ways of saying, pushing back against that externalization by saying, we're actually just doing what we were doing before in a different way. I'm not saying family separation is the only way to do this, but I have found, as a US focused person, I have found that so many of the people that have been externalized actually have family here in the United States to sort of be united with. And I mean, one of the things I do is I write reports. After being in Guatemala, my organization, one of the major ways, as we know from the DACA decision today, to push back against some of these policies is in the courts. And again, that can make people from the outside feel very helpless, because how can you get engaged in the courts? But, as my organization tries to support that litigation, to provide, to provide declarations and proof about why these policies are unfair and a violation of human rights that can then be used in court against them. And also, these are just ways, the Senate is one of our major stumbling blocks. There is legislation proposed, the Refugee Protection Act, that would actually, create new resettlement opportunities and widen asylum eligibility. The House, it's ready to go. If you could write to your senator and say, look, this is really bothering me. Especially we want this legislation to move forward. We can change policy. We just have to make sure our voices are heard by policymakers in Washington.
Great. And maybe a follow-up. We actually have another question. Thank you so much, YAEL, from Anna. And she says, what recommendations do you have for high school students to be able to impact policy? So a bit of a follow-up, how can we as U.S. citizens make our voices heard, and perhaps in particular high school students? I know, Joanna, you guys work with a lot of high school age students. Do you have any suggestions?
I was wondering if I was going to get called on. I think to answer both the previous one and this one, go back to that word deserving in the initial question. The folks that we work with deserve the very best and the most persistent advocacy. They don't deserve to have us give up and say, well, change isn't possible. They deserve us to be just as persistent as they have been on their journey. And I think high school students are in a really unique position to be able to do that. Especially, as YAEL was speaking about, we need to impact the way that senators view this challenge. Senators view this as very distant. They view it as not a priority. They say, well, I have other things that my constituents are telling me. So we really need high school students, as well as other people in the community, to be persistently contacting legislative offices and saying, I know that I might not even know an asylum seeker myself, but I believe that this is an important priority because of my values or because of the larger community. So to the extent that you can write to your offices, handwritten letters especially, or call in to offices. The great thing in this virtual age is that more offices are doing digital meetings. So you can, even without flying to Washington, you can ask for a meeting with your Senate. And so I'd encourage you, high school students and others, to continue to reach out to their congressional offices on a persistent basis regarding several of these policies. And the other piece I would say is that high school students can really affect public narrative. Wouldn't it be great if tonight, this is World Refugee Day is in 2 days. What about writing an op-ed in your local paper or in your high school newspaper about what you heard in this webcast today? Those kinds of op-eds and letters to the editor, bring it home for people in your community, and that ultimately also affects the policymakers.
Great, thanks, Joanna. We have a few more questions, but I think we only have time really for one more. We're at the hour mark, but we wanted to get this one in. This is from Brian on Facebook. And he says, currently in the US, many activists are promoting calls to defund various governmental organizations, and in this case, the police. But what are your reactions to defunding other US agencies like ICE? So this is maybe a bigger question too, just about funding for US programs, enforcement programs, but also the asylum program. What are some thoughts on where the funding should go or how those programs should be implemented?
So one of the things I didn't get a chance to talk about in my, wide-ranging quick history was the fact that the United States, since like the 1990s, the budget for enforcement for DHS has just ballooned, whereas the budget for asylum adjudication and for the immigration courts is very, very small and certainly hasn't kept up with the pace. So what we need to do, and this is sort of related to a lot of the the ideas when people say defund the police. What they mean actually is, well, maybe not that we don't need police at all, but what we need to do is actually put resources into the systems that will actually prevent the initial encounter with the police, the sort of more humanitarian focus. And so I think that's similar. Like, we need to focus on asylum adjudication rather than on putting people in prison. Like, prisons are like the most expensive way to deal with asylum seekers. It's not efficient. It's not humane. Conditions are terrible. During the COVID crisis, for example, we have over 4,000 asylum seekers who have passed their credible fear hearings who are in prison for no good reason. Again, so part of the idea when people say defund ICE, and ICE is who controls those immigration prisons, is to say, okay, first of all, is this the right way to spend money? Is this humane? Is there another way of using resources that would actually be more effective, which is to allow people to have their claims? And if they, so I think it's more about prioritizing how we spend resources.
Great. Would anyone else like to chime in before we wrap up? We're all good? Great. Well, thank you all again. We appreciate our panelists for taking the time to be with us today. Really appreciate all of your work in preparing for today and for being with us. And a special thank you to everyone else who participated virtually, our audience, for taking the time to be with us. We hope you can stay involved by learning more about these issues and by taking action. So please consider visiting our website at www.jrsusa.org/welcome-and-protect and signing a petition to policymakers asking them to protect access to asylum. You can sign the petition and then share it with your friends and across your networks. That'll absolutely be one step forward in making these issues known across our networks, but also in directly communicating with our policymakers. So thank you again, everyone, for taking the time to join us. We look forward to staying in touch. Have a great afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.